Hello everyone, welcome to our Cafe Latte chat. Today we have with us Datuk Paul Lau, Minister in the Prime Minister's Department, Pemandu Anti-Corruption Director, Mr. Ravindran Devagunam, MACC Director of Investigations, Datuk Mustafar Ali, and Deputy Education Minister, P. Kamalanathan. Now, one of the key issues that has cropped up with corruption is in the early days of Malaysia. During Tengku's time, this did not seem to be a problem. However, as our economic boom started in the 70s and 80s, unfortunately, it appears to be a byproduct of rapid economic growth. Why do you think this has evolved, Dr. Paul?
It is true. During the early days, I suppose during that time, everyone, including government, including private sector, was striving to build a nation. And also for the private sector, they were trying to make a living. And I think at that time also there were unemployment, So the issue of survival is there. And also there is less opportunity to engage in corruption. But as we have high economic growth and globalization, people's values change. Basically, I think as we grow further, materialism comes in. It's okay if you can handle materialism, but if it's unbridled materialism and it creates through all sorts of advertisement or the needs and the wants changes, the more needs we have, So I think unbridled materialism can turn to greed, can turn to greed. And unfortunately, I think the old values of honor, honesty slowly erode, In some cases, I think dishonesty becomes being admired in some cases. So I think we need to go back to the days where we honor and value honesty. And of course, the other factor that affect is because of money politics. During the time of Tunku's days, money politics, I don't think it exists the way it is today. So when you have money politics, obviously they need to finance political campaign, including party elections and all that. And those candidates needs to look for financing. And when they do that, they will look for sources and support, particularly from the business side. And when that happens, when they come into power, obviously they have to pay back somehow to the people who support them. In TI terms, when I was in TI, we call this state capture. That means they need to capture the state apparatus, machinery, and alter it in such a way that they can favor themselves. For example, closed tender, private negotiation, all these things, So
how are we going to break the system?
Well, first thing is we need to look at the root cause of it. Well, if it is value system, so we need to bring back to our youth about good values. We need to define what proper boundaries. That's why the society need to define what is proper and what is not proper. And we have to start also from the youth and from the education side.
Okay. Perhaps on the education, I can turn to does it start in moral class? How are we going to ensure that Malaysians have very clear about the path that corruption could take?
I recently read a book, and it says 5 important aspects to combat corruption. Okay, and one of those 5 is the system needs to do a reform. There must be a reform in the system. And when we talk about the system, we realize that knowledge is poor. And where do knowledge begin? Education. We need to empower the present education system to tell them from a very young age that corruption is not only bad, but it's evil. We have to instill those information into early education, primary, secondary, as early as that. Because only then it drives into a child that bribing, and which has to be clearly defined what corruption is, what bribing is, because you cannot go across the board and everything is a bribe and corruption. Then even accepting a gift on a birthday would be defined wrongly. So it has to be clear definition, and then I think this would help. Of course, there are initiatives right now, it's being done, but perhaps more need to be done in order to ensure that before we reach a developed nation status, we will be able to instill this knowledge into the system.
Can I
Yes, sure.
can I jump in here a little bit? I think I'd like to tie up what YB and Dato' Paul just said, but going back to our growth days, the heydays of the 90s, when we were one of the 4 Asian tigers. I think it's about then, or slightly before then, that a sense of competitiveness set in the private sector. And the private sector then looked at corruption or paying a bribe as a strategic tool to win favor and to be ahead of their competition, right? It's not to say that this is only pervasive to Malaysia, right? It's gone through the US, it's gone through Europe, it's gone through the Scandinavian countries, but they've kind of come out of it. And it's about the time of the late 70s where the US realized and they started enforcing the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. And it took them ages to kind of set that in place and move that forward. Whereas Malaysia, our businessmen have come to accept that a bribe is a strategic tool. That's one thing I think from an education standpoint, we also need to, maybe it's time not to go on about corruption per se, but maybe it's time to educate the public on integrity.
Yes. If I can move to Datuk Mustafar, it's clear that there have been very high-profile people who've been investigated and in certain cases prosecuted. Starting again, the most famous case I remember was former Selangor Menteri Besar, Datuk Sri Harun Idris. How, if it's already established, why do you think the Malaysian public is still needs to learn this lesson?
You see, what Ravindran mentioned just now about strategic tools, I remember there's one conference where a particular personality stood up and said, and to our surprise, he said, we have to allow certain extent of corruption to make things done, to make things speed. So that of course, this is not the way things to be done. That's why the answer, of course, we said zero tolerance against corruption. We cannot tolerate even a single, a minimal situation or condition. But talking about the high-profile cases being investigated and prosecuted, yes, we have high-profile cases that being investigated and prosecuted. You mentioned just now about Datuk Harun Idris case. We have Menteri Besar being investigated and prosecuted, and even last week we have heard Menteri Besar was, the conviction was upheld by the Court of Appeal. But people must look at MACC. We are the investigators. To prosecute or not to prosecute, of course, this the Attorney General's office that will decide. And this is the beauty of the system, the separation of powers. But once the case is, some of the cases we lost in court because of technicalities, because of lack of evidence. It's not because of anything, but because we are talking about evidence. We are talking about witnesses, documents. Some of the cases, tons of documents involved. And the cases, my point is that people cannot say the perception when we lost, or this is, quote unquote, the actor so-called, or they said sandiwara, all that. This is not sandiwara, but we are talking about a commitment of the authorities, the MACC, the Attorney General's office, the government, of course the court, because once the case, lose a case in court, because of the evidence. We have had cases of high-profile cases again that involve politicians in Pahang, for example. We charge the personalities, the politician, but what happened? There are 9 witnesses that are hostile. Meaning to say, they give evidence that opposite from what we have been given earlier. So we lost, not to say lost the case, we offered no evidence. We cannot continue with the case.
That's certainly one of the drawbacks that we face.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going to take another short break and we'll be back with you soon.